So aperture is one of those things that sounds pretty easy on the surface, but often can be kind of confusing once you dig a little deeper. The main reason for that is because it sometimes gets confused with other closely related terms that have to do with the aperture. Today on Digital Film Dojo, we're going to go really deep into the ins and outs of the aperture in your camera lens and really understanding how to use your aperture properly on set to get the best images possible. My name is Brian and I'll be your sensei for today. So first off, what exactly is the aperture? No, not that aperture. The aperture is a space through which light passes through in an optical or photographic instrument, such as a camera. A couple of other terms that are thrown around when we're talking about aperture are f-stop and iris. Understanding what these terms are referring to and how they work together is very important when you're getting exposure for your shot. The iris is the actual structure of the aperture in your lens, and f-stops refer to the numerical value associated with the aperture. Now, the aperture in your lens ultimately affects two different variables in your shot, and it's good to remember what they are. The first one is pretty obvious, which is exposure, but the second one, which is often sometimes overlooked, is depth of field. Referring to exposure, the wider open your iris gets, the more light it's going to bring in. And the smaller the hole gets, the less light it's going to bring in. It functions pretty much just the same way our eyeballs do, considering our eyeballs have irises. Science. So like I said before, your exposure level while using the aperture is going to be measured in f-stops. These usually can range from about f22, which is all the way closed, to around f2 or 1.8 or 1.4, which is extremely wide open. So something really important to remember, and something that can be a bit confusing at first, is the fact that when the f-stop number gets lower, your shot actually gets brighter, and when the f-stop number gets greater, your shot gets darker. So it's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect when it comes to exposing. What's even more confusing is when your f-stop gets higher, it's called stopping down. And when your f-stop gets lower, it's called stopping up. Why is it this way? I don't know. I don't make the rules. But if you're able to just wrap your head around that, you'll be good to go. So switching over to depth of field now. The more the aperture opens, the shallower the depth of field becomes. What is depth of field, you ask? Well, it's kind of like doing it right now, sort of. Depth of field pretty much refers to how much in your foreground and your background is out of focus or in focus. The shallower your depth of field, the more the background and the foreground of your subject is out of focus. And the deeper the depth of field, the more everything is in focus in your shot. Shallow depth of field is basically that blurry background that makes shots look really pretty. It's that new feature on the iPhone that all your family members like to use and go crazy about, but don't actually understand what it is. They just think it looks pretty, which it does, but on the iPhone, it's actually fake because the iPhone doesn't have an aperture or a sensor that's powerful enough to actually do that. It just kind of does it afterwards, But here comes the most common problem when it comes to aperture. Let's say I want to be that cool filmmaker that gets all those cool depth of field shots in my film. But I'm shooting outside and I open up my aperture in order to get that depth of field look. But because I do that, my shot gets too overexposed. And then I'm not a cool filmmaker anymore. How do I be a cool filmmaker now? Well, this is where a couple other variables come into play. If you want to achieve a certain look with your aperture, you're going to have to use a couple other tools to compensate for the exposure, such as shutter and ISO, or gain on some cameras. Bad cameras, but ISO also affects the exposure in your camera, but its numbering system actually makes sense. Shutter speed isn't considered an exposure tool, but when you change your shutter speed, it actually does affect the exposure. The higher you bring your shutter speed, the darker the shot is going to get, marginally. But this creates yet another problem. If you raise your shutter too high, you're going to risk losing your motion blur in your shot, and that's another thing that makes your shot look pretty, and you really won't be a cool filmmaker. And that's sad. You want to be a cool filmmaker. That's why we do these things. So now what do? Well, there's one more tool that you can use. They're called ND filters. ND stands for neutral density. ND filters are either pieces of glass that you put on top of your lens or pieces of glass that could be built into your camera. And all they do is simply just cut your exposure without affecting any other variables. It's sort of like putting on sunglasses for your camera. So if you have ND filters, and they're really not expensive to get, You'll be able to compensate for your exposure without losing anything that makes your shot look really good, and you will be a cool filmmaker. So now that we're all experts about what Aperture is, how do we actually use it properly on set? Well, it all depends on what type of shot you're trying to get, and it doesn't always have to do with how bright or dark your scene is. Let's say you're getting a wide shot with a lot of nice scenery. For this type of shot, you're going to want to keep your aperture as closed as possible. This will allow you to keep everything in your shot super clear in focus. There's really nothing in these types of shot that needs to be out of focus. If you have your iris open on a wide shot, you might not notice that anything is out of focus when you're looking at your camera screen. But when you blow up the video later, you're going to notice there's going to be certain things that are going to be slightly out of focus. And we don't want that. Remember, cool filmmaker. On the flip side, if you're going to get a more close-up shot, you're going to want to open up your aperture pretty wide so you can get that cinematic looking shot that we all crave. The more you open up the aperture, the more the background behind you is going to be out of focus. Just be mindful not to bring your aperture down too much if you don't need to, because this could create some unwanted effects. For example, if you're doing a close-up and your aperture is down to about 2.0 or 1.8, the focus in your shot might be so fine that there actually might be parts in your actor's face that will be more in focus than other parts. And in some situations, this might actually be what you're going for, but in many situations, it's not. So aperture can vary from lens to lens. When you're shopping for lenses, you'll notice that they'll be labeled by the focal length they are, and by the lowest f-stop they can go. The highest f-stop they can go, which again is the lowest number. For example, this lens is an 85mm f1.8, which means its f-stop can open all the way to f1.8, which is pretty wide open as far as lenses go. Anything that gets more wide open than that can be pretty expensive, but again, they can achieve really amazing looks. Something to keep in mind, most zoom lenses and most kit lenses won't have apertures that can get very wide. They usually range from about f3.5 or f4 or so. Lenses with fixed focal lengths or prime lenses tend to have these wider apertures people go for. Therefore, using prime lenses is a popular choice on most film sets. I'll be diving more in depth into lenses in a future episode to come. Or maybe it's already out if you're watching this in the future, you time traveler you. So no matter how you set your aperture, you're going to always have your exposure to deal with. So you'll have to go through the process I described before in order to get your shots properly exposed. In some other later videos, I'm going to go over some of those other specific variables we talked about, including shutter speed and ISO, etc. But out of these variables, aperture might be the most important of them all. So if you want to learn more about cameras and all their functions, or if you want to learn all different types of aspects of filmmaking, be sure to subscribe. I release new filmmaking tips, tricks, and tutorials each week. And as always, if there's any specific topics that you want to be covered, be sure to comment down below with your thoughts. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to comment with those down below, and I'll do my best to try to answer them as quickly as I can. So like, comment, share, subscribe, everything, do it all. I'll see you guys next week. I hope you guys have a nice weekend, and I'll see you for the next video. Bye, everyone.